The Interrobang podcast is brought to you by Simply Financial. Flex on your ex-bank with up to $700 from Simply Financial. Visit simply.com today. Conditions apply.
Hello and welcome to the Red Couch Podcast. I am your host, Ben Harrietha. This week on the podcast, we're going to zoom out from London and Fanshawe to the international scale to talk about some world news. Joining me to chat about the world's state of affairs, Interrobang Editor Hannah Theodore. Hannah,
hello.
Welcome.
What's up, Ben? How's it going?
Yeah, it's going good. I'm excited to talk about world news because there is so much stuff going on, and it's hard to talk about news with people who aren't following the news.
Yeah, I mean, especially with the state of things right now, I think, well, gosh, we're probably just real downers if we try to talk about any of the stuff going on.
Yep.
Because it's not all great. Not all great.
Yeah, I try to talk about like some of the stuff that's going on with my roommate, and I could like actively see her mood like decreasing as I say more things.
Well, and isn't it fun when it's like, yeah, this is what's going on in my brain all the time, every day. Like I never escape this.
No, I'm like, this is
barrage
always
of information I'm exposed to.
This is always what's happening. It's just like this in my twisted mind.
Yes. Ooh, welcome to my beautiful not fantasy.
So on that note, what stories are you what international stories are you like really keeping an eye on, or national anything, honestly?
Yeah, I mean, there's all kinds of stuff. I guess like starting kind of close to home, I'm like fascinated by this Toronto mayor situation. You know what's interesting is I had someone in my office yesterday. They were a student from India. They were asking me about John Tory, and they had been hearing about this resignation. He was like, "Why did he have to resign? Like, I don't understand." And I was like, "What do you mean? Like, he had an affair." And he was like, "Yeah, but like that's his personal life." And he started talking to me about how like in India, like the politicians are all corrupt, and like they're criminals, and everyone knows they're criminals, and they're still in power. And I was like, "Well, that's not good." I was like, "That's not good though." And I was like, "I agree that here I think we do have like a weird moral thing in the West, especially about like extramarital affairs, which I do think are more common than people want to admit. However, it was a staffer who was significantly younger than him. There's a power issue there, right? So trying to like, to me, it was like, yeah, no brainer, but also no brainer in the sense that like, here we are again with like men in power doing just what they do, I guess. Yeah, I grew up in Toronto, so I saw like the Rob Ford saga play out in real time. Do you remember that?
I was a little young to really be understanding what happened.
What's crazy about that is that like people like late night hosts were talking about us. People they don't talk about Canada.
No.
Like not municipal politics on like Jimmy Fallon, but it was so shocking that we had like videos of our mayor smoking crack and like doing press conferences talking about like how he didn't like have sexual relations with a woman, but in much less friendly terms than that. Like it was so wild. And here we are like under his brother's premiership with a mayor that was just given unprecedented mayoral powers by the provincial government, and is now resigning from that position because of like pure foolishness. And 63% or something of his supporters actually don't want him to resign.
Yeah.
And they're reportedly Doug Ford and Chrystia Freeland have also suggested that he not actually resign. I think it just gives you such a clear idea of like the state of where we're at right now in Ontario, and especially in Toronto, where I just think something super weird is going on, especially considering how close this all was to the whole developer scandal with Doug Ford. It just feels like a pretty wild distraction. Anyway,
it's like,
that's where I'm at with that.
yeah, and it's so messed up that like so many people on council and again reportedly that Doug Ford is like, no, don't quit, don't quit. And
Yeah.
it's like I don't think the problem is that he just had an affair. It's that
Yeah.
he had an affair with a staffer
Mhm.
who wasn't like weren't they like a lot younger than he was
Yeah,
also?
she was like 31 and
Yeah, and he's like
he was
he's
68.
pushing 70.
Yeah,
You know?
not cute.
Definitely not great. Why do
Yeah.
politicians keep doing this?
I don't like something happens to dudes in power. Like I don't know what like this sense of entitlement and it's just shocking that I can't imagine the dude was married for 40 years.
Yeah,
Like what are you doing? What are you doing? And why did you think that you were going to be able to keep this a secret? So like we have to, as journalists, like we have to shout out the Toronto Star for breaking that story.
mhm,
Because I don't think that he would have resigned if like it had stayed a secret, right? This was like a couple years ago, if I'm not mistaken. So how the fact that it went this long without anyone knowing, and he was just going about his business, increasing the police budget, giving them $300,000 for a freaking podcast. Like, what?
yeah,
And now he's gonna stay in power long enough, probably for this proposed budget to pass. Um, just for one last little screw you to the city of Toronto.
yeah.
Um,
I will say, as much as you can get, I don't want to be like props to John Tory, but because John Tory sucks, and but I will say it seems that he at least is sticking to the idea. He's like, no, I'm going to resign, even though people are
yeah,
telling him don't resign. He's like, no, I'm going to. Like I made a mistake. I'm going to resign.
Yeah, I think that if he does follow through with it, then that will be like the only respectable thing I think he has ever done or can do at this point. Um, I really think that there's nothing more embarrassing than like clinging to power in
Yeah,
any respect. That's why, like, I mean, we were kind of talking about this before, and I don't want to get super into it, but like Jacinda Ardern resigning and now Nicola Sturgeon resigning, like, I almost think that there's something way cooler about acknowledging that you're not the best person for the job right now, and there's maybe someone who could do it better than you. Um, and then like taking the initiative to step down and say, I'm not handling this well right now, and I know that I want the people that you're serving to be served as best as possible, right? I think that's way more noble and respectable than just clinging on to power when you're like pushing 80 and you know, barely able to form sentences anymore, and yet you're still, like, in this huge position of power. Like, I just don't appreciate that.
not to name any names of world
Yeah, I'm
leaders or
not, like,
anything, you know.
suggesting anything, but, like, I think I really do have, like, I really think there needs to be, like, age limits on
No,
some
you're
certain
right.
political positions, but,
It's
yeah,
it's
so
it's kind of funny how you can look at take the presidents of the United States for an example, and how
yeah.
you can look at how like who are the worst presidents that the states have ever had, and who are also the oldest presidents, and you find that a lot of the time they line up.
There's some overlap there.
There's a little bit of overlap.
Yeah,
So politics is it's so wild sometimes because it goes from being like incredibly boring to just scandal because it seems like they
yeah.
just all happen within like 5 months of each other.
Yeah, right. Well, and I'm pretty sure John Tory's mandate when he first took office like 10 years ago was that his goal was to like bring boring back to the city of Toronto after, all the kind of chaos that we had endured prior to that, which I had been speaking about earlier. So, I think that realistically he did achieve that for a good long time. There was not we never quite reached the levels of scandal that we did with Rob Ford. Um, but I think under the Ford government and especially with these new mayoral powers this past year. And I think when a lot of things came to light in 2020 too about police budgets and policing in general, Toronto kind of came under the spotlight because they are sort of the biggest municipality with probably the biggest police budget in Canada. Um, during the Black Lives Matter movement of summer of 2020, like there was a lot of conversation there, and a lot of stuff came to light about these police budgets, especially in Toronto. So to see how that not only got ignored, but then also we actually increased the budgets. It just felt like there was a push for progress, and perhaps in his attempts to keep things boring or sticking to the status quo, perhaps we didn't achieve a lot of the progress I think you'd hope a city like Toronto would achieve, right?
Yeah. It's man, I hate the state of Ontario politics right now. It's just so frustrating seeing it like as like a young person.
Yeah, I bet.
It's just like everything's on like I don't want to be like everything's on a downward spiral, but it's so like disheartening sometimes to
Yeah.
see some of the policy changes that are being put in place and like how people are talking about um some of the more progressive policies.
Hmm.
It's just and like it's just so like frustrating.
Yeah. I mean, I hope that things are going to kind of ebb and flow, and like we go through these cycles of conservatism, and we often come out the other side feeling like this, sort of disillusioned and angry and confused, and then we'll have a few years of the opposite of that, and then the other side gets angry and confused, and we go back and forth forever. I think we're seeing that right now with like the moral panic on a broad scale related to like LGBT issues in the States, especially, right? Like all these policies that are being passed at the state level about trans folks. Like and the things that they're saying are like the exact same things they said, 20, 30 years ago when the conversation was like about gay marriage,
Mhm.
right? I saw someone talking about how, so back then, there was or in the 90s especially, there was a really popular trend called like the ex gays. And these people would kind of get paraded around Christian, like daytime television, and also any kind of show that was trying to spark conversation about like the fears surrounding queer people. And the ex gays were like people that would kind of come on and say, like, I used to have homosexual thoughts, but then I saw God and I turned my back on that and now I'm not gay anymore. And they were like they kind of trucked these people all over the place because they were like, look, see, it's possible. It is a choice and you don't have to stay that way, right? And it really fed into their argument, and that being gay wasn't just something that you were born with or that was inherent to your identity. And now we're seeing the same thing at the state level at these hearings they're holding with the detransition crowd, right? It's kind of the same thing that they find like they're like, first of all, it's like less than 1% of trans folks who actually detransition. And research shows that the reason they detransition is because of like hatred and discrimination that they face throughout the transition process, not because they don't want to be trans anymore. Um, and they bring these people out to these hearings to say, look how sad they are that they went through this and how horrible their lives are now. And it's just like they're recycling all the same talking points to scare people from the same things they were trying to scare them from, you know, however long it's been since the last time we did this, right?
Exactly. And the thing they don't understand is like it's like, yeah, our lives are miserable because you're making it miserable.
Yeah.
It's like there's a reason we all like these people are detransitioning because they don't want to have to deal with people harassing them and
Yeah,
possibly dying.
exactly.
Like I I recognize that I'm in like a pretty good place of privilege being like white first off, and then also even though like I'm non-binary, it's like I still look like a man, so people aren't gonna mess with me,
Mm,
obviously. But like that doesn't mean like I have friends who are trans women, and they're like, yeah, it's sometimes scary to just go outside because
yeah.
I know that some people are just gonna be um weirdos is I think too soft a word to say.
But it's true. That's yeah, I see what you're saying though. Like,
Like yeah, like people are just gonna be really weird and dense about who I am as a
yeah,
person when really it's not anyone's business except your own, I think.
right.
Um
Well,
when it
and
comes to
like
like gender presentation.
exactly, right? Like the weirdness, and the weirdness is the best case scenario, right? Because the worst case scenario is that you actually face violence and, the rate at which trans folks are murdered just for existing, right? And I think like the detransition conversation too has a lot to do with how comfortable cis people are with how passable trans people are as the gender that they identify with. Like, they always we will never talk about Buck Angel again, but people always use the example of like, do you want Buck Angel in a woman's washroom? Right? Like this is your standard of like what by these people's definitions, right? Folks that seem very passively male or on the other side very passively female. In your mind, they should just walk into the bathroom that aligns with the gender they were assigned at birth, right? Um, and then I want to look at these people and be like, would you actually feel comfortable with that? You really just are basing your entire perception of these people on how they appear to you, right? Because I think if someone who like passed fully as female walked into a woman's washroom, I don't think they would have the same reaction because they're imagining a fake scenario, right? Where some dude in a dress is like attacking them in washrooms. These are
Yeah.
imagined scenarios that are not happening. Um like and
Yeah, it's like
again we find that like the thing that we're actually afraid of is cis men, right? Like
yeah.
that's everything comes back to that. Like that's what women are and everyone I think are generally more afraid of. It's not the sneaky trans folks that are pretending, you know?
Yeah, because like I don't know, most trans people just want to get about their day, and they
Yeah.
don't really care about what like other like. And the the weirdest thing, they're like some of these people who are doing like the moral panic. They're like, but what if you were in the bathroom stall and the person beside you had a penis? It's like, okay,
Like I don't care.
I don't care. Why do
I was
you
at
care? That's weird.
exactly. You know what? I was at the Grand Theater this weekend or last week rather, and they have gender neutral washrooms. And it's really cool how they lay them out. Like the stalls are fully private, like they have full on doors with like locks on them. But then like everyone shares the sinks and all that. And it's really cute. They have like pads and tampons right on the counter. Um, and the only complaint I had is that men still don't put the seat down, even when they have to share washrooms.
No,
But
of course.
otherwise, it was fine.
Men's
Like,
washrooms are the most foul place on the planet. Um, they're the worst. And
uh,
I feel like no one should experience a men's washroom. I'm glad the gender neutral washrooms are becoming more of a thing.
yeah,
Because it always has just made sense to me to have it set up in that way. Like Western
yeah,
has washrooms in the same kind of style where
yeah,
it's like a fully like it's almost more like a change room with a
yeah,
toilet, if that makes sense.
yeah.
And then they just have sinks. And so when we went and did distribution there, I was like, oh,
Hmm.
this is like really like this is the way you should do a gender neutral washroom. I think this is just the way you should do any washroom.
Well,
Um,
like, yeah. I
because like
mean, is your washroom at home divided by gender.
Exactly,
Like,
right?
like
I'm
we
like,
all understand the concept of just going to the washroom and then continuing with your day. Like, why are they so fixated on it?
yeah, and it's like the weirdest thing is like some people like will call out trans people for going to washroom. It's just like, just leave me alone, man. I'm just trying to, go pee.
Yeah, yeah. No, it's so bizarre. I think the other piece too, and this is the other thing that kind of harkens back to well, I mean it's a constant conservative talking point, but like the kids. Oh my God, but what about the kids? And that's the other thing that seems to be the topic of conversation in a lot of these state hearings. And I think it's all because of like gender criticals on Twitter that conflate gender affirming care with, this is the same thing they always say. It's all about like, and I'm sorry to use like such strong language, but like mutilation. We're
Yeah,
mutilating children. You're cutting off their genitals. Like you can't even get through to these people how much that is not happening, right? And almost, I was saying this yesterday that like you can almost see why they're so outraged if that's what they really think gender affirming care is, right?
yeah,
And that it must be really confusing for them when like adult trans folks go to these hearings and talk about how life-changing and beautiful and beneficial gender affirming care was for them. And in these people's minds, all they're imagining is childhood genital mutilation, right?
yeah, and it just
Unfortunately, they're wrong, but
yeah, it just shows how little they actually know
yeah.
about this stuff because, like, no, we're not going to put your 6-year-old on estrogen. No, we're
Like,
not going to, like, no.
yeah.
uh,
And
the only thing that like may happen at that age is that like when they turn to be like 12, they might put them on blockers of some sort. So
yeah,
it's it just shows how little they actually research and know about this stuff. And they just say things. They just basically
exactly.
they just talk out of their behind.
Yeah, it's
Um
it's a combination of like refusing to acknowledge because like the research is out there, right? Like the data is there and the testimonials from real human beings exist, but they don't care about that. And either they're like willfully choosing to ignore it, or what I see from like a lot of people who think this way is that they straight up think that like scientific studies are lying. And like I've been watching a lot of those Jubilee videos where they have like two opposing sides. Do you ever watch those?
uh I try to avoid debate videos. They make me angry.
Well, honestly, same. Like I really struggle. I hate debates. These videos I find interesting because they're usually not experts. They're just people who like it'll be like liberal parents versus conservative parents. Like just people with beliefs that are just, usually certain sides tend to be perhaps a little bit more educated, but the side that especially when it's like anti-trans, anti-LGBT or anything that's anti-science, like people will cite data and research to their faces and they'll be like, "Well, that's a lie. I don't believe that stuff. I don't read that stuff. That's not true."
Yeah.
It's like they actively will like deny the reality of those studies. So you really cannot get through to them if they just have convinced themselves that those things are not true and they're not credible. Um, because what is true to them is the detransition subreddit and Matt
Yeah.
Walsh's Twitter. Like, it feeds back into what their true core fear. And I think the core fear is that my child might turn out to be gay or trans.
Yeah.
Um, right? And so because ultimately it goes against their whole belief system as conservatives to suggest that like the laws that they're passing are infringing on people's freedoms. This goes against their whole thing, right? Because it's not your child that we're turning trans. It's someone else's child and you're trying to stop them from accessing that care. But I think it's because the fear is that if the child in my child's classroom starts to transition or starts being asked to asking to use different pronouns, then that's going to influence my child somehow. And then they're going to get these ideas and then they're going to become this way too. Um, which is it's just crazy.
Yeah. And it's like that old saying, it's hard to win an argument with a clever person. It's even harder to win an argument with an idiot.
Yeah.
Because yeah, that's true. You can basically present all the facts possible,
Yeah.
and these people will just go, no.
They don't care.
And it's like, well, okay, this isn't a debate. You're just not you're just being obtuse.
Yeah. Yeah. Literally.
And I don't know. And the whole argument of like, oh, what about the kids? Kids don't care.
They don't care.
They don't care.
They don't care.
This stuff is learned. They don't care.
Yeah. Well, and that's
inherently
the thing,
kids
right?
are kind. Like
they think that like the reason that people want children to learn about LGBT people, right? Because no one's this is another thing, right? Like no one is teaching your kids how to have gay sex. They're just teaching them that gay people exist.
Yeah.
Right. And like and what is wrong with that? And then they start to reveal themselves, right? When you start asking those kinds of questions. So it becomes the usual fallacies, right? The slippery slope argument. Well, if you
Yeah.
teach them about this, then you're going to start teaching them about this and this and this. And it's like now you're conflating queerness to a bunch of bad things, right?
Yeah.
So you've literally just revealed what you truly feel, which is that you think that queerness is something that is too awful for children to be exposed to, and that we should just let them be kids because, oh my God, how could you ever open them up to something so hard to understand? Like it's healthy to just start conversations because then your kids grow up to be less hateful. They don't grow up to be gay. Maybe they will, but if they were going to do that anyway, they were going to do that anyway, whether you taught them about gay people or not.
Yeah, exactly. Man, it's just it's all bad. I want to talk about one more thing before we finish up here. I did want to talk about
Yes.
the Ohio train
Oh my
derailment.
God. Yeah.
Because that and unfortunately we're running out of time on our Zoom meeting, but we
Okay.
will have at least 5 minutes to chat about this because this has been on my mind since it
Yeah,
happened.
dude. I mean, I think at the very least, it's even if we don't have a lot of time, I think it's good that we just are mentioning it because it's probably the New York Times just reported on this yesterday. It happened on February 3rd.
Yeah.
Why are the conversations just now happening? People on the ground have been talking about the like effects of what happened. And this is now like in the last like week, there have been 2 train derailments, including the one in East Palestine, and now a truck with like crazy chemicals also like pouring out over the highway. And I'm gonna forget where it is. Texas. It was in Texas. Um, like environmental disasters are happening all over the United States, specifically in the transportation industry, which has been historically underfunded with underpaid workers and like very poor labor conditions.
Yeah.
And now the environment and communities are going to suffer because of this.
And it's people are like trying to be like, well, this is an accident. It could happen. It's like, no, this was a entirely preventable accident because what happened was that they were all the upper execs of these train companies and railway companies were like, yeah, you know how you usually take 3 minutes to inspect each car? Get that down to 90 seconds or you're going to lose your job. And so they just basically stopped inspecting a lot of the cars because they needed a job. And that ended up leading to it's a train carrying vinyl chloride and 9 other hazardous chemicals.
Like
And I think the other thing that a lot of people, especially like Canadians, don't realize is how close that is to us.
If
you were able to, it's across the lake, so you'd have to drive around the lake. But if you were to able to drive straight to Ohio, like East Palestine, Ohio,
Yeah.
it would take 2 hours.
And never mind that these rivers, right? People have probably heard about the fish dying,
Yep.
right? If you've heard anything about this story, that's probably what you've heard. That river flows into like a Great Lake,
Yeah.
which provides drinking water for us and those states that border them as well. So this has vast implications. And I think it not just environmentally, not just in terms of health, but in terms of like labor and conversations that are not happening around this industry. Because guess what? Truckers and trains, these are the kinds of things that we're talking about automating down the line. You know, look how these systems are failing with decreased human review, right? And now they're talking about fully automating these industries. We're doomed. You know, that's not,
Yeah.
you know, we need human action and human awareness of what's going on the ground. Not less of that. Not less.
And the worst part of it, I think, is how quickly they returned people to their homes.
Shocking, yeah. Before
And
they even knew. Like,
yeah, and they're like, "Oh, it's the air and water are still safe." And people are like, "Hey, why are there like a bunch of dead fish in the river still?"
yeah.
And
yeah.
like that squirrel just fell out of that tree dead. Like I don't
Yeah.
think it's safe to be here. And
Yeah.
and they're just like, "No, no, 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 no. No, you're fine."
There's a story on Vice right now about a guy who his whole family, they had just like started paying off their mortgage on a house in East Palestine, and now he says like we're leaving. Like cuz he lived right next to the train derailment too. Like exactly right beside where it happened basically. And he was like, first of all, like no one's going to buy this house now ever.
Yeah.
They're living in an Airbnb because they don't want to stay in the home. They had to leave their dogs there, but their dogs are fine. And like he's got like a kid and a wife, and they're living out of an Airbnb because they're too scared to live in their home that they were just starting to pay off. Like, and that's only because he has the awareness enough to know that that's not somewhere he should be, right? Not everyone might have access to that or know that, and they're just going back home to risks unknown, right?
Great.
Yeah, it's negligent. It's scary.
Yeah. I love the world we live in.
You know, the good news is like where we are is that we get to watch these things unfold down south. And I almost feel like we can be prepared for them when they do start to trickle over here, whether that's anti-LGBT rhetoric, whether it's political scandals, or whether it's environmental issues. We can really learn, I think, from what we see in the United States and try to not let those kinds of things take over here. Um, there's uproar right now in Kelowna about a billboard. I don't know if you saw this. Um, with they've got like the Pride Progress flag on it and a big billboard that says, "Do you know what your kids are really learning in schools?" And then like a website to something about being anti-woke or whatever.
Yeah.
And the community is fighting back because they're like, no, we don't do this here. This is not, we are not going to go down this rabbit hole.
We're normal here.
Well, we're going to, at the very least, we're going to try to be normal, right? Because this is, as soon as these ideas start gaining steam here, we don't need another freedom convoy. You know,
Definitely not.
We don't need people invading school board meetings to complain about wokeness. Like, let's be better. Let's be better.
And be better. That's the message of this podcast.
Yeah.
So thank you for joining me this week, Hannah.
Thanks, Ben.
All right. And thank you guys for listening to another episode of the Red Couch Podcast. As always, you can catch up with every episode on our website or wherever you get your podcasts. Pick up your copy of the Interrobang on newsstands now. Follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. And be sure to subscribe to our newsletter to keep up with all things Fanshawe. For the Interrobang, I'm Ben Harrietha.
The Interrobang podcast is brought to you by Simply Financial. Flex on your ex-bank with up to $700 from Simply Financial. Visit simply.com today. Conditions apply.